Mrs. Dorothy just wanted a peaceful morning like any other day. But as she stepped out of the grocery store, she was suddenly arrested by the police on charges of theft. No one listened to her explanations, and the cold handcuffs tightened around her frail, aging wrists. But when the trial began, an unexpected figure appeared, a powerful billionaire, and the truth started to unfold. A thin layer of mist blanketed the poor neighborhood that morning. Pale sunlight filtered through the bare branches, casting fractured beams of light onto the uneven, pothole-ridden street. The air carried the faint aroma of diluted coffee from a small shop at the street corner, mingling with the warm, inviting scent of freshly baked bread. Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, 72 years old, stepped out into the cool morning air. Petite and frail, she was wrapped in an old, faded coat. Her thin hands clutched a grocery bag tightly. Inside were the essentials for the week: a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, a few apples, and some fresh greens. She emerged from her usual grocery store, a tiny place, but always filled with warmth and familiar conversations. The glass door quivered slightly as she shut it behind her, leaving the shopkeeper inside, busy counting inventory. From across the street, a few neighbors waved. "Mrs. Dorothy, how are you this morning?" She paused, smiling, the deep wrinkles around her eyes crinkling. "I'm well, dear. Thank you." Her smile had always carried warmth, a quiet kindness that the whole neighborhood recognized. She was a familiar figure, gentle, always willing to lend a helping hand. Adjusting the bag in her grip, she carefully stepped down onto the pavement. A morning like any other. And then, screech! The piercing sound of brakes shattered the fragile tranquility. Mrs. Dorothy instinctively took a step back as a police car sped toward her, stopping abruptly just inches away. A thick cloud of dust rose into the air. The neighbors turned their heads. Some frowned. Others whispered among themselves. The car door swung open. A man stepped out, Officer Mike Garrison. He was in his 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, his police uniform crisp and uncreased. His face was angular, his expression hard, and his sharp gaze held the weight of authority and suspicion. One hand rested on his gun belt, his every movement deliberate and controlled. No one spoke. The tension stretched thin, like a thread about to snap. Garrison's heavy boots crunched against the pavement as he approached. Then, in a voice as cold as tempered steel, he commanded, "You, stay where you are. Hands up." The entire street fell silent. Mrs. Dorothy stood frozen, her fingers tightening around the grocery bag. A deep sense of unease settled in her chest, creeping down to her fingertips. "Is there a problem, officer?" Her voice was small but steady. Garrison didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded paper, skimmed it, and then tucked it away again. "You match the description of a theft suspect. We have evidence." A sharp pang gripped her chest. She looked around, searching for a familiar face, someone who would vouch for her. But her neighbors stood still. Some averted their eyes. A hesitant voice murmured from the crowd, "That's impossible." Mrs. Dorothy wouldn't steal. She struggled to keep her breathing steady. "I don't know what this is about. I was just buying groceries." But Garrison wasn't interested in her protests. He reached into his belt and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The metal gleamed coldly under the morning sun. Click! The cuffs snapped open. Mrs. Dorothy instinctively stepped back, but age had slowed her. In the blink of an eye, her frail wrists were locked in place, the steel biting into her skin. Tears spilled down her weathered cheeks. Not from pain, but from humiliation. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others shook their heads in silent disbelief. She had never felt so small. She had never imagined she would be treated like a criminal. Out in the open, in the very neighborhood she called home. Mrs. Dorothy's wrists throbbed beneath the cold metal. Her frail fingers trembled, but she wasn't sure if it was from fear or humiliation. She couldn't bring herself to look up at the crowd. She didn't dare meet their eyes, whether curious, suspicious, or worse, the ones that had already turned away, distancing themselves as if she were truly a criminal. She opened her mouth, wanting to speak, wanting to protest. But the words wouldn't come. "My grandmother didn't do anything wrong." A voice shattered the heavy silence. "Tanya." Mrs. Dorothy turned her head, and though her eyesight had dimmed with age, she recognized her granddaughter's silhouette in the crowd. Tanya was running toward her, her short, curly hair a mess from sprinting. Her face was flushed with anger, her brown eyes blazing with fury. "What are you doing? Let her go." She planted herself in front of Officer Garrison, fists clenched at her sides. But Garrison's expression remained unreadable, as if he hadn't heard a word. "Step aside, miss. She is being taken into custody according to procedure." "What procedure?" Tanya shouted. "What evidence do you have? You can't just arrest someone because they vaguely match a description." Mrs. Dorothy had never seen her granddaughter this furious before. The girl she had raised, the child who once curled up beside her during thunderstorms, was now standing in the middle of the street, facing off against a police officer, protecting her. But Garrison remained unmoved. "Everything will be handled at the station. If you want to help your grandmother, follow the legal process." He gave a subtle nod to the officer beside him. The man stepped forward and opened the squad car door. "No, you can't do this." Tanya lunged forward, reaching for Mrs. Dorothy. Thud! A heavy arm blocked her path. The other officer grabbed her firmly, his grip unyielding, his expression cold. Tanya struggled. "Let go of me. Don't touch me. You're interfering with law enforcement." Garrison's voice was like a sharpened blade. The warning made Tanya freeze. She turned to her grandmother, her eyes welling up. "Grandma." Mrs. Dorothy bit her lip, willing herself not to cry. She didn't want Tanya to get into trouble. She shook her head slightly and whispered, "Don't fight this, Tanya." Garrison didn't wait. He grabbed Mrs. Dorothy's arm, firm but controlled, and pushed her into the back of the squad car. She had no choice but to comply. The car door slammed shut. Bang! Mrs. Dorothy flinched. The interior of the police car was dim and stifling. The smell of old plastic mixed with the cold metallic scent of the cuffs on her wrists. She pressed her forehead against the small glass window, watching Tanya still standing there, motionless in the middle of the street. The wind tossed her hair wildly. Her hands were clenched, her whole body tense. The siren wailed. The car began to move. Tanya snapped out of her daze. She ran after them, shouting, "Grandma, I won't let them do this. I'll find a way to help you. I promise." Mrs. Dorothy closed her eyes as tears spilled down her cheeks. She wanted to believe in that promise. She had to, because if she didn't, she would have nothing left to hold on to. She had done nothing wrong. But would justice be on her side? Mrs. Dorothy Hayes shuddered as the heavy metal door clanged shut behind her. The stifling air reeked of rust and dampness. The holding cell was small, just a few square meters, its bare concrete walls enclosing her like a cage. A flickering fluorescent bulb cast weak, sterile light, creating long, eerie shadows that stretched across the cold floor. She stood still, trying to steady herself. Her wrists still throbbed from the tight grip of the handcuffs. She had never imagined she would end up here. In one corner, a young woman with tangled hair and a gaunt face curled up against the wall, staring vacantly at the floor. Further away, a middle-aged man sat with his arms crossed over his knees, his breath slow and labored. No one spoke. No one needed to. They all understood. Once you were in here, words wouldn't change a thing. Slowly, Mrs. Dorothy lowered herself onto the freezing metal bench. Her frail hands clutched at each other as her mind reeled. What had she done wrong? She had only gone to buy groceries. She had only stepped out of the store, as she always did. And then everything had unraveled in an instant. Surrounded, handcuffed, shoved into a police car, out in broad daylight, under the eyes of everyone. No one had helped her. No one had spoken up. She had become a criminal before anyone had even proven she was guilty. Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced them back. "I won't cry. I won't let them see me weak." For decades, she had learned to live with injustice. But that didn't mean she accepted it. Clank. The cell door swung open. A police officer stepped inside, glancing at her. "Dorothy Hayes. Someone's here to see you." Beyond the holding cell, Tanya stood on the other side of the thick glass divider, her brown eyes burning with frustration and worry. She had been running around nonstop since the moment her grandmother was taken away, making phone calls, searching for contacts, trying everything. But nothing had worked. Tanya clutched the receiver tightly, her fingers shaking. Grandma, her voice cracked. Mrs. Dorothy picked up the receiver and forced a small, weary smile. I'm all right. Tanya gritted her teeth. No, you're not. You shouldn't be here. Mrs. Dorothy tightened her grip on the phone. Tanya, don't worry about me. You need to stay calm. Tanya shook her head, her eyes flashing. They have no proof. They arrested you just because you looked like someone. I won't let them get away with this. Mrs. Dorothy sighed. I know, Tanya, but you need to be careful. You can't let your anger lead you to make mistakes. Tanya clenched her fists. She refused to accept this. She couldn't. Her grandmother was a good person. Everyone in their neighborhood knew that. A kind, elderly woman who took care of her family, who helped others whenever she could. And yet today, they treated her like a criminal. Mrs. Dorothy looked at her granddaughter, her gaze full of love. Promise me you won't do anything reckless. Tanya pressed her lips together. But I won't stand still. I will find a way to get you out of here. I promise. Mrs. Dorothy gripped the phone tighter, closing her eyes. She wanted to believe in that promise. She had to, because if she didn't, she would have nothing left to hold on to. Knock, knock. A sharp rapping on the glass interrupted them. A police officer approached, tapping firmly on the divider. Visiting time is over. No, I'm not done talking. Tanya shot up, slamming her palms against the glass. Inside, two officers stepped in and grabbed Mrs. Dorothy by the arms. Grandma, Tanya called out. Mrs. Dorothy turned back, but she was already being led away. Tanya watched as her grandmother's frail figure disappeared beyond the door, her heart tightening in her chest. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. She clenched her fists, taking a deep breath. They had arrested the wrong person, and she was going to prove it, no matter what it took. Late night at Tanya's apartment. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the rhythmic sound echoing through the silent room. Tanya sat in a chair, her hands clenched tightly together. The small apartment was dimly lit by the soft glow of a desk lamp, casting shifting shadows across her face. She had tried everything, calling the police, asking around the neighborhood, searching for anyone who might be able to help. But no one dared to get involved. They were afraid. Not everyone was willing to stand against the police, against a system that had long been stacked against people like them. Scattered across the table were messy notes, Dorothy's grocery receipt, blurry surveillance images, a list of potential witnesses. But they were just fragments. She needed someone who could connect the dots, someone unafraid to take on the police. A name crossed her mind. Marcus Reed. Knock, knock. Tanya jolted at the sudden knock on her door. She rushed to open it. Standing before her was Marcus Reed. Tall, dark-skinned, dressed in a dark button-down, the sleeves rolled up, revealing strong, defined forearms. But what stood out most were his eyes, sharp, focused, the eyes of someone who had faced injustice before and refused to back down. Tanya. His voice was low, firm. We have work to do. Tanya stepped aside, letting him in. Marcus entered, scanning the chaotic mess of notes and papers spread across the table. He picked up one of the grainy surveillance photos. They're trying to convict an old woman with this? There was a hint of mockery in his tone. Tanya folded her arms, holding back her anger. They said she matched the description. They didn't care if it was true or not. Marcus set the photo down, deep in thought. We need more than this. Do you have her receipt from the store? Tanya quickly rummaged through her bag, pulling out the crumpled slip of paper and placing it on the table. Marcus picked it up, scanning the numbers. Good. Now we need confirmation from the store owner. If he has security footage inside, we might get a clearer image. Tanya nodded but still felt uneasy. And if they still refuse to listen? Marcus gave a small smirk, his eyes filled with unwavering determination. Then we make them listen. Step 1. Finding a witness. The next morning, Tanya and Marcus arrived at the small grocery store where Mrs. Dorothy had shopped. Behind the counter stood George Miller, a middle-aged man with graying hair. The moment he saw them enter, his expression tightened with unease. Tanya approached first, keeping her voice steady. I'm Dorothy's granddaughter. You know she's innocent, don't you? George glanced around nervously, as if checking for unwanted ears. He sighed. Tanya, I know your grandmother is a good woman, but I can't get involved. Marcus stepped forward, placing the receipt firmly on the counter. Dorothy was here at the exact time of the robbery. You just need to confirm that. George swallowed hard. If I help you, the police could come after me. Tanya's hands clenched. And if you don't, an innocent woman could go to jail. George's gaze flickered. His hesitation was clear. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he reached under the counter, pulling out a small hard drive. This is the store's security footage. If anything proves she was here, it's in this. Tanya held her breath. A glimmer of hope. Marcus took the hard drive, nodding. Good. We'll check it. But just as they turned to leave, what are you two doing here? A voice cut through the store like a blade. Garrison. He stood at the entrance, his sharp gaze locked onto them. Silence hung in the air. Tanya tightened her grip on the hard drive. Garrison stepped closer, lowering his voice. I'd advise you both to stay out of this. The system isn't so easy to fight. Marcus met his stare head-on, unwavering. Then let's see who changes first, the system or us. Tanya and Marcus walked past him, leaving the store. Garrison didn't stop them, but Tanya could feel it. A storm was coming. At the police station, the showdown begins. The small interrogation room was suffocatingly tense. The only sound was the steady ticking of the wall clock, though no one in the room paid it any attention. Tanya sat across from Officer Mike Garrison, her jaw clenched. Beside her, Marcus Reed remained upright and composed, his sharp gaze locked onto their opponent. Garrison leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. He looked relaxed, but Tanya didn't miss the flicker of irritation in his eyes. He didn't like being challenged. He wasn't used to being defied. Marcus slid a folder across the table. Mrs. Dorothy has a receipt proving she made a legitimate purchase. This is a copy from the grocery store. Garrison picked up the file, flipping through it lazily. A faint smirk curled at the edge of his lips. This isn't enough. Tanya gritted her teeth. Are you kidding? This is clear proof. Garrison leaned back, arms still folded. His voice was calm, but laced with condescension. Proof? A crumpled piece of paper that could be fabricated? I have a surveillance video. If this goes to trial, I think a jury would find my evidence far more compelling. Marcus remained composed. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small USB drive, and placed it on the table. Then maybe you'd like to compare it with the real security footage? Garrison's smirk disappeared. Tanya saw it. The brief flicker of unease in his expression. Marcus continued, his tone unwavering. We obtained the actual footage from the store's security cameras. It clearly shows Mrs. Dorothy at the checkout counter. No theft, no suspicious behavior. Just an old woman buying groceries. Tanya clenched her fists. You arrested my grandmother without cause. Garrison didn't respond immediately, but Tanya saw the way his jaw tensed. He was wrong, and he knew it, but admitting it? Never. With a sharp motion, he slammed the folder back onto the table. I'll review the case. Marcus arched a brow. No, you'll release her. Now. Garrison exhaled through his nose, his stare cold. Attorney Reed, I don't operate under pressure. Marcus tilted his head. Then what do you operate under? Truth or power? The air in the room turned ice cold. Garrison braced both hands on the table, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing. You don't understand how this system works. Marcus didn't flinch. Oh, I understand it perfectly. I understand it better than you. Tanya's heart pounded. The tension between them was razor sharp, each word slicing through the air like a blade. Finally, Garrison straightened, exhaling a long breath. Fine. He reached for the intercom, pressing a button. Release Dorothy Hayes. 2 hours later, the heavy doors of the police station swung open. Mrs. Dorothy stepped outside. On the sidewalk, Tanya rushed forward, throwing her arms around her grandmother. Grandma? Mrs. Dorothy held her close, her breath shaky. I'm okay, Tanya. I'm okay. Marcus stood a few steps away, watching the reunion with quiet relief. But the victory felt bitter. Dorothy had been released, but there had been no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The police had simply let her go, as if she had never been wrongfully arrested in the first place. Tanya clenched her teeth. They had won this battle, But the war was far from over. Dorothy wasn't the only victim. Tanya knew that there were countless others trapped in this broken system. People without a voice, without a Marcus Reed to fight for them. And she refused to let this be forgotten. She took her grandmother's hand, squeezing it tightly. "You're not the only one, Grandma." Dorothy nodded, her tired eyes filled with both sorrow and resilience. "So what do we do now, Tanya?" Tanya lifted her gaze to the sky. "We fight, not just for you, but for everyone who has ever been treated unfairly." At Marcus Reed's law office, Tanya sat in silence. Across from her, Marcus Reed flipped through a stack of legal documents, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. His office was small but orderly, shelves lined with carefully organized case files. Beside Tanya, Mrs. Dorothy Hayes sat with her frail hands clasped in her lap. Though she had been released, exhaustion still weighed heavily on her face. Free but not vindicated, Marcus placed the files down and met Tanya's gaze. "They're not backing down." Tanya clenched her fists. "I can't believe this. They know my grandmother is innocent. So why are they still pursuing this case?" Marcus sighed, crossing his arms. "Because they don't want to admit they were wrong." Dorothy's voice was hoarse. "How?" Marcus pulled another file from his bag and slid it across the desk. "Prosecutor Walter Rogers has officially filed charges. Even though Mrs. Dorothy is no longer in custody, she's still being taken to trial for theft." Tanya's teeth ground together. "They're stalling." Marcus nodded. "Exactly. If this case gets dismissed, it'll attract attention. The media might get involved. They don't want that." Silence settled over the office. Dorothy shook her head, sadness clouding her eyes. "So what do we do now, Marcus?" He leaned back in his chair, his gaze hardening. "We fight. And this time, we won't just prove your innocence. We'll expose the truth about what they've done. New discovery, the hidden evidence." That night, Tanya sat at the desk, staring at her laptop screen. Across from her, Marcus was surrounded by documents, case files, and printed surveillance images. What do they have so far? Heavy checkmark the receipt, proving Dorothy paid for her groceries. Heavy checkmark the security footage, showing her at the register with no signs of theft. Heavy checkmark GPS data from Dorothy's phone, confirming she never left the store area at the time of the crime. Marcus studied the list, deep in thought. All of this works in our favor. Tanya exhaled. But they still have that blurry surveillance video from the other store. Marcus nodded. And they'll try to use it to sway the jury. He stood and began pacing. Something wasn't adding up. Why did the police only have a low-quality video when most stores had high-resolution cameras? Were they hiding something? Tanya's eyes widened as a thought struck her. "Wait, doesn't the store have cameras in the parking lot?" Marcus stopped. "Yes." He immediately grabbed his phone and dialed George Miller, the grocery store owner. "George, how many cameras does the store that was robbed have?" George hesitated. "3. One at the entrance, one inside, and one in the parking lot." Marcus tightened his grip on the phone. "Did the police ever mention the parking lot footage?" Silence. Then finally, "No." Marcus and Tanya exchanged a look. They had buried it. If the police had ignored the parking lot footage, that meant it contained something they didn't want anyone to see. "We need to get that video." Marcus's voice was firm. Tanya took a deep breath. "If we do, they won't be able to keep this case alive." Just as Marcus was about to take action, his phone rang. An unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello." A deep, raspy voice came through the line. "You're Marcus Reed, the lawyer?" Marcus frowned. "Who's asking?" "I'm a police officer. I have information about the Dorothy Hayes case." Marcus stiffened. Tanya watched him carefully, her expression cautious. "What do you know?" Marcus asked. There was a long pause. Then, "I can't talk over the phone. If you want the truth, meet me tonight behind City Hall in the parking lot." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "Why should I trust you?" "Because I know what the police did. And if you don't come, Dorothy Hayes will never be cleared." Click. The line went dead. Marcus slowly set his phone down, his expression unreadable. Tanya swallowed hard. "This could be a trap." Marcus nodded. "It could, but if this officer was telling the truth, then they were on the verge of uncovering something big." He met Tanya's eyes, his resolve unwavering. "We're going." District Court, 8:30 a.m. The air inside the courtroom was suffocating. Mrs. Dorothy Hayes sat at the defendant's table, her frail hands clasped tightly together. She didn't belong here, but she had to be present, because if she wasn't, the system would forever brand her as a thief. Beside her, Marcus Reed sat upright, his sharp gaze scanning the room. Across from him, Prosecutor Walter Rogers remained composed, casually flipping through the thick stack of files in front of him. In the rows behind, Tanya sat among those who had come to support Dorothy. Her heart pounded. She knew that today would determine everything. If they lost, her grandmother's name would forever be stained. If they won, it would be a direct blow against a system riddled with injustice. The heavy courtroom doors swung open. Everyone stood as the judge entered, a middle-aged man with a stern expression. Court is now in session for case number 1783, the state versus Dorothy Hayes. The battle had officially begun. Walter Rogers stands. Walter Rogers rose from his seat, his expression unreadable as he approached the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court, we are here today to examine a case of theft. Surveillance footage clearly depicts a black woman in a dark-colored coat stealing merchandise from a store." He turned toward Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, his sharp gaze locking onto her. "That woman is the defendant, Dorothy Hayes." Tanya clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She hated the way he spoke about her grandmother, as if she were already guilty. Rogers continued, his voice steady but laced with quiet menace. "We have evidence. Security footage from the store clearly shows a woman resembling the defendant leaving the store without paying." With a signal from Rogers, a large screen flickered to life. A grainy, black-and-white video played. A woman in a dark coat passed by the cashier's counter, exiting the store without stopping. Rogers turned back to the jury, his voice firm. "Look closely. This is undeniable evidence." Some members of the jury nodded, while others squinted, examining the blurry footage. At the defendant's table, Mrs. Dorothy sat frozen, her frail hands trembling. They really believed that was her? Tanya's body was rigid with fury, but Marcus Reed remained still, his face unreadable. Now it was their turn. It's time to fight back. Marcus stands. Marcus rose to his feet, his movements calm yet commanding. He walked toward the jury, his sharp gaze meeting each of them in turn. "You've seen the video. Now I have one question." He paused, his voice deep and steady. "Are you absolutely certain that the person in the video is Mrs. Dorothy Hayes?" Silence filled the courtroom. A juror furrowed his brow. They weren't sure. Marcus turned toward the screen, pausing the video at the most crucial moment. The image was too blurry. The face was indistinct. He glanced at Rogers, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Prosecutor Rogers calls this undeniable evidence. But I ask you, could this be nothing more than an assumption? A few jury members shifted in their seats. Doubt had begun to take root. Then, Marcus turned toward Garrison, who sat stiffly in the witness stand. "Officer Garrison, you arrested Mrs. Dorothy Hayes in broad daylight, in front of dozens of witnesses, based solely on a blurry surveillance video. Do you truly believe you did the right thing?" Garrison shifted uncomfortably. He didn't respond right away. Marcus pressed on, tightening the noose. "You don't have to answer me. Answer the jury. Can you say, with absolute certainty, that the woman in this video is Dorothy Hayes?" Garrison's jaw clenched. He couldn't say yes, because he knew the video wasn't clear enough. But he also didn't want to admit he was wrong. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. From the defense table, Tanya watched Marcus, admiration stirring in her chest. He knew exactly how to turn the tide. Marcus turned back to the jury, retrieving a folder from the defense table. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is the GPS data from Mrs. Dorothy Hayes' phone." He held the file high, his voice unwavering. "It proves that at the exact time of the crime, she was at a grocery store, 2 blocks away from where the theft occurred." The courtroom stirred. Several jury members exchanged glances. Doubt was growing. Marcus stepped forward, placing the file on the judge's bench. "Your Honor, I formally request this evidence be considered. It completely disproves all allegations against Mrs. Dorothy Hayes." The judge turned to Rogers. Does the prosecution object? Roger's lips pressed into a thin line. There was nothing he could say. He couldn't argue against GPS data. Marcus took a step toward Dorothy, meeting her gaze. This system tried to convict you, but the truth speaks for itself. At the defense table, Tanya felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. They were winning. The judge's gavel struck the bench with a resounding thud. Court is adjourned for deliberation. The jury will now review the evidence before reaching a verdict. At the defense table, Tanya squeezed her grandmother's hand. We've done everything we could. Marcus's eyes flicked toward Rogers and Garrison. Neither spoke, but their clenched jaws and stiff postures made it clear they were furious. Now, everything depended on the jury's decision. But then, the courtroom doors swung open with force. A tall, distinguished man strode in, dressed in an immaculate gray suit. His silver-streaked hair gave him an air of wisdom, and his sharp but warm eyes radiated both intelligence and authority. James Whitmore, a billionaire, a social activist, a man who dared to challenge the system. The entire courtroom fell silent. Tanya's breath caught in her throat. What was he doing here? Marcus leaned back in his chair, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. Well, it's like the game just changed. Walter Rogers shot up from his seat, his shock evident. Your Honor, what is the meaning of this? His voice was tight with frustration. This man has no connection to the case. But James Whitmore continued forward, his steps measured, his deep voice carrying across the room with undeniable authority. No connection? I beg to differ. He turned to the judge, his expression composed but resolute. Your Honor, I have critical information regarding this case. Information that I believe will completely change how we perceive these charges. The judge frowned, then gave a slight nod. You may speak. Rogers slammed his palm against the table, his face flushing red. Objection. This is a blatant attempt to disrupt these proceedings. Marcus remained unbothered, his voice smooth. Mr. Rogers, if you're so certain of Mrs. Dorothy's guilt, why are you afraid to hear more of the truth? The jury began murmuring among themselves. Rogers inhaled sharply, his jaw clenched. Then, begrudgingly, he sat back down. He had no other choice. James Whitmore stood in the center of the courtroom, his hands clasped behind his back. I have in my possession a document that the police deliberately concealed. The entire courtroom shifted their attention to him. Reaching into his suit pocket, Whitmore retrieved a stack of papers, then turned to Marcus. Attorney Reed, I believe this is something you'll want to see. Marcus stepped forward, took the file, and quickly scanned the pages. Then his eyes flashed. This is an internal police report. Tanya held her breath. Marcus looked up, his voice like a blade cutting through the room. Officer Garrison, can you explain why the surveillance footage from the parking lot was omitted from this case file? The courtroom erupted. Garrison went rigid. Rogers slammed his fist on the table. This is outrageous. I was never informed of any parking lot footage. Marcus opened his laptop, connecting it to the courtroom's projector. The screen flickered to life. A new surveillance video played. Crystal clear. No distortion. No doubt. The woman in the footage was not Dorothy Hayes. She was younger, taller, and most importantly, she looked nothing like Dorothy. The courtroom collectively gasped. The jury exchanged whispers. Tanya clutched Dorothy's hand, her voice a shaken whisper. They knew from the beginning. James Whitmore folded his arms, turning to Rogers. Well, Mr. Prosecutor, do you still believe Dorothy Hayes is your suspect? Rogers was trapped. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he glanced desperately at Garrison, who sat frozen in place. They had been caught. The judge's gavel slammed down. The jury may now render its verdict. Tanya gripped her grandmother's hand tightly. This was it. The jury took less than 5 minutes to decide. A man stood, the foreman of the jury, his voice steady as he read the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Dorothy Hayes, not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Dorothy bowed her head, her frail shoulders shaking as tears streamed down her face. Tanya threw her arms around her, overwhelmed with emotion. It's over, Grandma. You're free. Marcus exhaled, a relieved smile crossing his face. Across the room, James Whitmore gave a slight nod, as if he had known this outcome all along. They had won. Rogers stood frozen, his face ashen. He had lost. Across the room, Garrison kept his head down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The judge turned to Marcus. "Attorney Reed, do you have any motions?" Marcus nodded, his expression razor-sharp. "I request an official investigation into the police department's deliberate suppression of evidence." The courtroom erupted again. Rogers paled further. Garrison's fists clenched at his sides. They hadn't just lost. They were now facing potential investigations. The system they had fought to protect was beginning to crumble. As Dorothy Hayes stepped out of the courthouse, the sunlight hit her tear-streaked face. For the first time, she was truly free. Tanya squeezed her hand. "We did it." Dorothy gazed upward, feeling the weight lift from her chest. Real freedom. James Whitmore approached, his voice steady. "This system needs change, and I believe you will be part of that change." Marcus nodded. "This is just the beginning." Dorothy smiled, her eyes still damp with tears. Justice does not come easily. It must be fought for, and she would not let anyone else suffer the way she had. The morning after, Tanya woke to a flood of missed calls and unread messages. When she unlocked her phone, her screen was filled with explosive news headlines. Loudspeaker, police department accused of suppressing evidence in Dorothy Hayes case. Loudspeaker, shocking trial. Black woman wrongfully arrested just for matching a description. Loudspeaker, Officer Mike Garrison and Prosecutor Walter Rogers face public outrage. Tanya smirked bitterly. They had won, but the truth remained harsh. It had taken a courtroom battle just to restore her grandmother's dignity. She quickly turned on the TV. The news anchor's voice filled the room. "The police chief has ordered an internal investigation into Officer Mike Garrison's conduct." Meanwhile, Prosecutor Walter Rogers is now under ethics review for possible misconduct. Tanya exhaled slowly. Now, they couldn't run from the truth. At the police department, Mike Garrison sat frozen in his office, staring blankly at his computer screen. The news headlines about the scandal flashed across the webpage. His email inbox was flooded with messages from higher-ups, their words sharp and unforgiving. "Explain this? Why was crucial evidence omitted from the case file? Do you realize what you've done?" A slap to the career he had spent 20 years building. Knock, knock. The door swung open. Police Chief William Carter strode in, a man in his 60s, his silver hair neatly combed, his expression unreadable. "Garrison, I don't have time for excuses." Garrison's jaw tightened. "Sir, I was just following procedure." The chief tossed a suspension notice onto his desk. "Then I'm following mine?" Garrison went pale. He had been discarded, all because of one old woman. Walter Rogers' office. Smack! Walter Rogers slammed his palm against his desk, his bloodshot eyes burning with rage. Across from him, his young legal assistant remained silent, head bowed. "How the hell did this happen?" Rogers snarled. "I controlled every aspect of this case." "How did Whitmore get that video?" The assistant hesitated. "It appears the police officer leaked it." Rogers' eyes narrowed dangerously. "Oh!" The assistant swallowed hard. They didn't reveal their identity. Rogers closed his eyes, inhaling sharply. He was in deep trouble. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Telephone receiver, Attorney General's office. His stomach dropped. Slowly he answered. The voice on the other end was cold, unforgiving. "Mr. Rogers, we need to talk about your future." Rogers went pale. He knew that future might not include him. Emergency press conference. Later that afternoon, outside City Hall, a row of high-ranking officials stood behind the podium. Police Chief William Carter, Prosecutor Walter Rogers, and city government representatives. Their faces were tense. Before them, dozens of reporters held up microphones, cameras flashing. "Chief Carter, can you explain why crucial evidence in the Dorothy Hayes case was hidden?" Carter cleared his throat, his expression carefully neutral. "We are conducting an internal investigation. Will Officer Mike Garrison be prosecuted? For now, he has been suspended, What about Prosecutor Rogers? Will he be held accountable for pursuing a case without solid evidence? Every gaze turned to Rogers. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he grabbed the microphone. I was simply fulfilling my duty. A reporter immediately cut in. So you're saying you bear no responsibility? Tension thickened in the air. Rogers exhaled. I will cooperate with the investigation. No apology. No admission of guilt. But the crowd's reaction said everything. The fight isn't over. Tanya watched the press conference unfold on TV. She wasn't surprised. People in power never admitted they were wrong so easily. Dorothy had been exonerated, but the system was still intact, full of people who refused to change. Garrison might lose his job. Rogers might be disciplined. But was that enough? Tanya's fingers tightened around her phone. No, it wasn't. They needed to do more. They needed to make sure there would never be another Dorothy Hayes, wrongfully accused, powerless, and forgotten. She turned to her grandmother, her voice steady. We can't stop here. Dorothy met her gaze, then nodded. They had started a fight, and they wouldn't back down. 1 week after the trial, Mrs. Dorothy Hayes stepped out of the taxi, standing in front of her small house. She inhaled deeply. The air was the same, but everything felt different. The wooden fence still had its missing slats. The front door still creaked every time it opened. But the biggest difference was in the eyes of her neighbors. As she stepped onto the pavement, a few people paused to look at her. Some smiled. Others remained silent. Dorothy couldn't tell what they were thinking. Did they believe in the truth? Or did they still see her as a thief who got lucky? The front door swung open. Tanya stood there, smiling warmly. Come inside, Grandma. Dinner's ready. Dorothy nodded, but before stepping in, she took one last glance down the street. She had won, but doubt still lingered in the air. Justice had come, but was it enough? At the dinner table, Tanya was just finishing setting the dishes when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Hello. A woman's voice came through. Tanya Hayes? My name is Linda Carter, director of True Justice Organization. Tanya's brows furrowed. She had heard of them before, a group of lawyers and activists who fought for the wrongfully accused. Yes, this is Tanya. What's this about? Linda's voice was warm but serious. We've been following your grandmother's case. The way you and Marcus fought until the end, it was inspiring. Tanya sat up, her heartbeat quickening slightly. Thank you. We just did what needed to be done. Would you like to keep doing it? Linda asked. Tanya froze. What do you mean? We'd like to invite you to join our team, to help others who have been wrongfully accused, just like Mrs. Dorothy. Tanya looked across the table at her grandmother. Dorothy was quietly eating, but her eyes were distant, thoughtful. Tanya knew this wasn't just an opportunity. It was a responsibility. After dinner, Tanya set her phone down, looking directly at Dorothy. What do you think? Dorothy took a sip of hot tea, her expression contemplative. Do you want to do it? Tanya inhaled deeply. Yes, but not just for me. She held her grandmother's gaze. There are so many people out there like you. I can't turn my back on them. Dorothy nodded, but remained quiet for a moment. Tanya hesitated. And you, Grandma, do you want to tell your story? Dorothy smiled softly, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. I've lived 72 years never imagining I'd be falsely accused, never thinking I'd be treated like a criminal. But maybe if I tell my story, it will help someone else. Tanya reached across the table, grasping Dorothy's hand. You won't do it alone. Dorothy squeezed her hand back, her gaze drifting toward the window. A new journey was about to begin. 2 weeks after the trial, we are broadcasting live from the NBC News studio. Today, we have a very special guest, Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, a woman who was wrongfully arrested and has since become a symbol in the fight against injustice. The camera panned to Dorothy, seated gracefully in the interview chair. She wore a light blue coat, her silver hair neatly styled. Her expression was calm, yet her eyes held the weight of everything she had endured. Beside her sat Tanya and Marcus, her unwavering companions throughout the fight. The host smiled. Mrs. Dorothy, can you share how you feel now that your name has been cleared? Dorothy took a deep breath, then spoke slowly. I'm grateful that justice was finally served, but I can't say that I feel completely at peace. The host raised an eyebrow. Why is that, ma'am? Dorothy clasped her hands tightly in her lap. Because I am not the only one. The studio fell silent. Dorothy turned to the camera, her voice steady. How many others have been wrongly accused like me? How many don't have someone to fight for them? How many don't have a Marcus Reed to take their case? How many don't have a Tanya to uncover the truth? Tanya felt her chest tighten. I was lucky, but justice should not depend on luck. Justice must be for everyone. The entire room remained still. The host nodded solemnly. You are absolutely right, Mrs. Hayes. But tell me, do you feel anger? Have you ever thought about revenge? Dorothy smiled gently, but her eyes gleamed with conviction. Justice is not revenge. Justice is change. Punishing one officer or one prosecutor won't stop the next wrongful arrest. I don't just want to fix my case. I want to fix the system. Marcus smiled, pride flickering in his eyes. Tanya squeezed Dorothy's hand. Dorothy was no longer a victim. She had become a force for change. 1 month later, a large conference hall buzzed with voices. Tanya stood at the podium, facing a packed audience. Behind her, a massive banner read, Green Circle Judicial Reform Conference, Justice for All Green Circle. The room was filled to capacity. Lawyers, journalists, activists, even former wrongfully convicted prisoners. And in the front row, Dorothy sat, watching quietly. Tanya inhaled deeply, then spoke. 1 month ago, I was just a granddaughter fighting to save her grandmother. Today, I stand here because I know Dorothy Hayes' story is not unique. She scanned the room, her voice clear and strong. We need a system that is truly fair. A system that sees truth before it sees skin color. A system that does not use fear as a reason to take away a person's freedom. And to make that happen, we must fight, not just for Dorothy, but for everyone who has ever been denied justice. Thunderous applause erupted. Dorothy smiled, her warm eyes fixed on Tanya. She was no longer afraid, because she knew this fight would not end with her. She gently clutched the small cross around her neck, whispering a quiet prayer. Lord, grant us the strength to continue. Justice doesn't end in a courtroom. It is a long fight, and everyone has a role to play in creating change. Dorothy Hayes' story helped expose a broken system. But how many others are still suffering injustice? If you care about justice and want to hear more inspiring stories, don't forget to follow for upcoming videos. Speech Balloon, share your thoughts in the comments below. Speech Balloon, your voice matters. Let's keep the fight going.